Okay, once again, welcome to the Unshakable Foundation meeting of Cocaine Anonymous. This is a main share meeting, and today it's with great pleasure and lots of gratitude that I'm welcoming Tarek K from Alabama. He's come to share for about 40 minutes around step 3, after which we'll open up for Q&A. With that, it's over to you, Tarek.
Thank you, Young. I'm a member of Cocaine Anonymous. My name's Tarek. It is great to be with you this afternoon for me. I want to thank Young for asking me to join this group and share a little bit of my experience. A power greater than myself separated me from crack cocaine, Oxycontin, alcohol, and several other substances on the morning of November 5th in 2007. And because of the loving community of Cocaine Anonymous, and as well as a few other 12-step fellowships, a group of people around me that care more about whether I live or die, instead of whether or not they're going to hurt my sensitive feelings. And the grace and mercy of a power I choose to call God, I have found it unnecessary to put a drug in my body or take a drink of alcohol to address any degree of psychological pain that I'm experiencing. And for that, I will be eternally grateful. This talk, I'm going to focus on step 3, specifically one passage, one sentence at the top of page 63 in our big book. It says, when we took such a position, all sorts of remarkable things followed. My interpretation of step 3 has changed drastically over my time here. Your experience walking the 12-step path, my experience walking that path, my experience with participation in the fellowship, as well as, practicing the 12 steps. For a long time, I thought the steps were something that were compartmentalized to a degree, because it's like you work the steps and you move on, but we never really complete the work with the steps. It's integrated into the way we live our lives, and eventually what used to be the hunch or the occasional inspiration gradually becomes a working part of the mind. That sentence in our big book in step 11 applies to every step. At least it has in my experience. And so the experience, the interpretation, the meaning behind the steps is all fluid. It's dynamic. It evolves over the course of time. The more experience I have taking people through the steps in the big book, the more experience I gain when I turn myself into a group or another man to take me through the steps. All of these add on to not only information and knowledge, which can't be helped, but what's more important than information and knowledge is the experience. And, this idea of taking a position, the word that I'd like to focus on is sincere, the heart. Sincerity for me has something to do with the presence of the heart. And over the course of time, the third step has become more about the abandoning ourselves. What are we willing to sacrifice and offer to protect the work that we call the 12 steps in the Fellowship of Cocaine Anonymous? I remember vividly the period of time. I just celebrated an anniversary. So November 5th was 16 years. So around this time of the year, I always drift back. I try to remember, but it's so difficult to remember because the person that's on this call with you this afternoon is not the person in the story that I tell from back then. And the further I get away from it, the more imperative it is to remember from where I came. And thank God for sponsorship, because that's one of the ways I get to travel back through time and revisit that person. But if you had taken a snapshot of Tarek in the few months leading up to November 5th in 2007, and especially since I had participated, well, I won't say I participated in the fellowships of the 12-step fellowships, but I started going to meetings, attending meetings long before November 5th, 2007. I started in 2004, so I had 3 years of picking up desired chips when I was high, getting high right after the meeting, having been up all night, still intoxicated, going to a meeting. And if you had looked at Tarek and you were going to describe Tarek during that period of time, you would have said he's self-will and riot, which is part of our third step. Tarek's a producer of confusion rather than harmony in his life, part of our third step. You would have said Tarek is in constant collision with people and circumstances in his life. Tarek lives by self-propulsion. He does what he wants to do when he wants to do it, and he does not consider the ripple effect of the action he's about to take. And Tarek was trying to violently twist out of life by managing well the happiness that he sought after, which is usually getting what I want, what I think I want. And I literally destroyed lives that were around me. And there's a pretty good description of self-will and riot. Now I fast forward 17 years in a couple of weeks. That was God taking me to my surrender. All of those events had to transpire in that way for my ego to be reduced to nothing, to be thinned out just enough where I was willing to follow the directions of another man. I had to experience the internal brokenness at a severe level. So all of those things had to happen. And so I woke up a few years into my journey and I realized I have no idea what God's will is. I think God's will is something that's unfolding in every moment of reality. In the way I experience reality, that is God's will. And so for me, after investigating some other spiritual traditions and coming to not an end point, but something that I can work with, which is this idea that if I think of God as an ocean, and the wave on top of the ocean is still the ocean, but it's a little bit different from the ocean. So I think of God's will as the ocean and self-will as something like the wave on top. Because some of the things that have occurred in my life behind the idea of self-will run riot have created surrenders, have created a new level of willingness, have created a new degree of curiosity. Why am I behaving this way? I need to have an inquiry into why I'm behaving this way. The investigation, the accountability that we form with other individuals, all of those things were given, they came into existence through my struggle with aspects of this thing called self-will. And so it's really hard. How can I call something self-will run riot as part of our third step 17 years and 2 weeks ago? And now today I say, no, that was God's will. That was God taking me to my surrender. It's very interesting when we look at it that way, when we sincerely take such a position. And so it's interesting how simple our way of life here is. I was incarcerated. I got out of being incarcerated. I landed into a residential treatment program, and they took me to a meeting that I wanted them to take me to because there was a man that I kept thinking about when I was incarcerated who had tried to carry the message to me years before. I also went to some big book studies at this man's house, and for whatever reason, he was the image I kept thinking about when I was in this jail. And I said, okay, I must find this individual. And so they get me and they take me to this meeting. It's a Cocaine Anonymous meeting. It's on a Friday night. I would get there, I'm late. I walk up to the church and there's one person on the phone outside, and it's an individual who was sponsored by the man I was thinking about. And so I just latched on to the first person I saw, and I knew he was connected to the man I wanted. And so I asked this man for help. I said, I don't want to die living this way. Will you please help me? And that man began to meet with me once a week. What was interesting about this time in the process versus the previous times in the process is the voice in my mind that would constantly lie to me, constantly give me people that I thought I could manipulate, other ways to solve my problem, get the right job, get the right girl, hang out with the right people, ask my parents for more money, whatever it was. Those were gone. There wasn't a desire to even go after any of those things, this was part of the surrender, the spiritual surrender, the part of the first step that I don't think we can work. And so I start meeting with this man, and it's time to take the third step. And so I'm sharing with this talk, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share many experiences I've had with the third step, because it's it's hard to focus on that line without giving you all of the experiences. I could sit here and talk about mechanics and talk about the information around the third step and taking this position. But we're a storytelling society, and hopefully through my sharing of these stories, somebody will access their story and someone will see a new meaning behind their story. And that's what we have here. We exchange stories and we gather on our brokenness, and we help each other become more human, to be put back together, because our experience of drugs and alcohol dismembered us. It tore us apart. It destroyed our humanity. And then by the grace of God, we're brought back in here and we're put back together and we're remembered, put back together. And this experience with the third step, because I had experienced a surrender that had devastated my ego. It had thinned my ego out. The voices in my head that lied to me were suspended for some reason. And so following the directions of another man, I never questioned it. He said, call me now. I called him then. Meet me 2.5 hours before the home group. Meet 2.5 hours before the home group. You need to go do this H&I commitment. You need to help set up this group. You need to clean up after the meeting. It didn't matter what direction I was given, because I was tired and I was done and I wanted to live. You know, for the 3 years prior to that, I knew what the phenomenon of craving was. I knew what the mental obsession was. I knew what unmanageability or spiritual malady was on an intellectual level, but I had no surrender. And therefore, nothing changed. The catalyst for all of this is that surrender. And so we get to the third step, and we talk about when we sincerely take such a position on the source of remarkable things will happen. We were in the basement of this treatment center, and we were doing step work, and the guy taking me through the steps, he said, let's go find a place where we can take this third step. And we went into a closet, a storage closet in the basement. And I got on my hands and knees with another man, and we held hands, and we read the third step prayer out of our big book. God, I offer myself to you to build with me and to do with me as thou wilt. I just said those words and I meant them. But what was really important is he coached me. He said, Tarek, at the end of the day, we don't know what God's will is. We don't know what's going to happen. What this means is we need to get out of the outcomes business, the results business. We need to do our best to place the outcome in God's hands. And what this really means, Tarek, is you're going to make a decision to use the 12 steps as your design for living moving forward. That's all this step means. And if you don't work the steps following this, nothing's going to change. No effect will be produced from this decision you're making. That's how simple it was. But for a man who had several different belief systems about what a man's supposed to do, a man's not supposed to get into a closet with another man. A man's not supposed to get down on his knees with another man. A man's not supposed to hold hands on his knees in a closet with another man. These were old ideas, but until these were let go, absolutely nothing could be accomplished. And so they were taken from me. I don't know if I made it willful choice to have them just go away. All I knew is my life was on the line. And so I decided to make the decision in the third step. And we got up and he said, do you have your notebook? And I had a 3-ring binder with a bunch of paper in it. And he's like, let's start writing inventory. And he gave me a packet and gave me some examples on how to write inventory. And I started writing the inventory. And so that, to me, I've taken many third steps since that third step. But the sincerity in that third step is what I remember to this day. When I say sincere, it's not gauging the level of honesty per se. It's gauging the presence of my heart in what I was doing. My heart was present and I had knowledge of why I was making this decision. And so that was fuel for a while. But there's several surrenders. Some would even say there's a surrender behind each step. And so I mentioned earlier that I was incarcerated. I had been arrested for drug trafficking. And I was looking at several years in prison at this time. And so my lawyer, who was a friend of mine, got me a lawyer who was in that business. Now, my family didn't want anything to do with me. My brother and my best friend wanted nothing to do with me. But one of my friends that I sold drugs with, he went and got me a lawyer. I didn't ask for it. It was by the grace of God. And the attorney that he got me happened to be a police officer who had become a district attorney, who was now a defense attorney. So this was not lost on me, the circumstances that were forming around me. But he worked it out so I could go to a 90-day inpatient residential treatment center, and I worked the steps. When I was 4 months sober, I started sponsoring that. I started making amends before that. I got back into school. I got hired on at the treatment center as overnight staff. I was taking guys to meetings back and forth. I got another job, so I was working 2 jobs, and I was documenting all of my progress. If I took a drug screen, I wanted a copy of it so I could send it to my lawyer. So we began to build a file, and I was terrified about going to prison. The last deal that the district attorney gave me was 3 years in prison in a work camp, and if for good behavior, I could be out in 18 months. That was the deal they gave me. And thank God for the men that held my hand through this process, because there were days when I was afraid, and they would say, Tarek, what's on page 68 in our big book? It says, God, remove my fear and direct my attention to what you would have me be. You place the outcomes in God's hands. Maybe there's someone in that prison for you to carry the message to. They would give me advice like that. Tarek, go pray about it. Tarek, go be of service. Everything I was instructed was about, okay, Tarek, you've taken this position, and now you have to live like you took the decision, made the decision. That means as difficult as it is, because the hardest thing about trusting God is trusting God. And it's a back and forth. It's a fluctuation of back and forth. And so some days were very difficult, other days were not so difficult. But I'm going to tell you what happened, because that position I took in the closet in the basement of the treatment center, it came full circle 9 months later. 9 months after we'd gone through several court hearings, several different district attorneys, a couple of different judges, I get a phone call. I now have this little studio apartment right down the street from the treatment center. I stayed close to the treatment center because I was sponsoring guys there, and I thought it was just a safe decision. And I'm sitting in the kitchen of my studio apartment, and I get a phone call on the morning of August 5th in 2007. And my attorney, he says, Tarek, I don't understand what happened, but somebody upstairs truly loves you. They just dropped all the charges. Okay. And so I share this part of my story because it makes no intellectual sense. The word miracle is that one of the definitions is when we witness something that we cannot explain. It's inexplicable. What just happened? And for me to have all the charges disappear with no probation, no community service, I didn't have to go and become a narc or a rat and turn on somebody and work for the cops. None of that happened. It's interesting because I was in that lifestyle. There were several people on my amends list that were drug dealers that I had to go make amends to because I owed them money. These were not people down on the block or the abandoned houses or the trap hotels where I spent all that time. These were people that I actually broke bread with, that I harmed. I stole things from, I took money from, I cheated them. I had to go make amends. And then there were a few of them that thought I worked for the police because I couldn't show up to that amends and say, you know what, man, God did for me what I couldn't do for myself. That's why the charges went away. It just wasn't going to work like that. And I think to this day, there are probably still people out there that think something along those lines. But what happened to me in my studio apartment when I received the news was a new level of sincerity around taking such a position. Because all I could think about that morning was, we hope after reading these pages, no further authentication is necessary. I knew that the way of life described in our big book was going to be the modality for me living my life from that point until whenever God takes the spirit out of this body. I don't know when that is, but that's the commitment that I made. It was a renewed commitment with a greater degree of sincerity of what am I willing to do to live this way of life? What am I willing to do to protect this way of life? There have been many things that I've had to sacrifice because of this way of life, and I am fine with that, because I'm the one that has to live with what happens to Tarek when he puts a crack pipe in his mouth. Nobody else does. Everybody else they get a choice. Eventually they say, we're done, we're walking away. I don't get to walk away from me. I'm the one that has to live with it. And so that it's of the utmost importance that I protect this way of life. What does that mean? What does that look like? It means I protect the service commitments. I protect my morning devotion. I protect the phone calls that I have with other
Tarek.
Uh-oh. Can you hear me? I apologize. I think my earbuds just died. What was the last? Can anyone tell me the last thing they heard so I could start there?
You protect your commitments, protect your service commit. Yeah.
So the protection there, and as it relates to this decision, is what am I willing to do to protect the work? And what our work is this 12-step way of life. And that experience in my studio apartment created a new experience with my heart, and how important it was for my heart to be involved in this process. Because as we move through the way of life described in our big book, and we take these steps and we integrate them into who we are as human beings, we begin to have different experiences at different times. I have never been a part of a sponsorship family that spends a lot of time talking about turning it over and taking it back. I've made many mistakes that could have been under the idea of I took it back and I made a decision. But then later on down the road, there's a clearer understanding of why that event had to take place the way it did, and it gave me a new understanding and a new meaning behind the experience. So there's not a lot of debate back and forth. I really, at the end of the day, I don't know. I don't know what it means to turn it over and take it back. I do know what it means to carry an awakened spirit, and I know what happens to me when my spirit I'm blocked from it. I'm separated because I'm identified or overly fixated with some aspect of my personality or what I need in this world in order to be okay or have security. And that's the struggle from here on out. And so what ends up happening is when we sincerely take the position, I had a surrender to crack cocaine and Oxycontin and alcohol. And the surrender was quite clear. I was done. It broke me. It reduced me to nothing. I became willing to do whatever I had to do to never be in that position again. But then there's a surrender that happens later, the surrender to self. And I can't speak for anyone else but myself. I've had many surrenders to self over the years that's described on pages 60 to 62 when they get into the director piece. And it's interesting because our way of life here is probably the greatest shell game on the planet, because the authors of the big book, they spend 62 pages plus the doctor's opinion talking to us about our relationship with drugs and alcohol. And then on the top of page 62, they tell you that the root of our troubles is selfishness and self-centeredness. Now, what do you think would have happened if they turned page 1 and said, hey, selfishness, self-centeredness, that we think is the root of all your troubles? None of us would have stayed. We would not have hung out and waited. But they had to talk about alcohol. Then the shell game, they switched it, right? They switched it. The God is the solution. But there's another shell game, that the selfishness and self-centeredness is what the whole thing's about. This whole way of life that we have here, I don't know if it's truly about God, spiritual awakening, or facing and being rid of those things which block us. To me, that's what this whole thing is about. It's similar to the prayers that I say. Like, for me to pray about what's going on in my life and ask for guidance and direction, and to want to have some signs to direct me and point me in which way I need to go, That doesn't always happen for me. Circumstances don't change when I pray. But you know what does change when I pray is the perspective that I have changes when I pray. So the third step, that sincerity in that position that we take, it doesn't have as much to do anymore with what may or may not happen. I don't know. The will of God can sometimes be very uncomfortable, can create a lot of darkness in our lives. But the true faith comes when I'm going to be carried and protected and kept safe through this entire process if I just stay grounded in the middle. And what I mean by in the middle is that circle and triangle, because this is our way of life. Recovery, unity, and service. That's what we experience here. Our mind is transformed through the recovery process. We find the bonding and the relationships and the fellowship that we crave, that unity found in that legacy. And then we feed our spirit by sacrificing our personal time. It gives us that feeling of usefulness. And as long as I can do that, being carried is a possibility. Being safe and protected is a possibility. And so when that line in our big book in the third step, God, please take away my difficulties so that victory over them may bear witness. Man, that's what this is about. I always wanted, why God? Why are you doing this to me, God? I'm being led to talk about something. In 2014, I'm just over 6 years into this path. And I asked a man from Colorado to take me through the steps. And we get to step 3, and now I have a new interpretation I want to share with you around when we sincerely take such a position. So we're sitting on a Skype call. This was before Zoom. This was back when Skype was a thing. And he says, Tarek, when you think of the third step and you think of God's will, what do you think about? What comes to mind? And I told him some nice, loving things, being of service, being confident, being a child of God, seeing God and God's kids, and hearing God's voice through their voice, and et cetera, et cetera. He said, Tarek, let me ask you a question. I was married at the time, and I had a stepdaughter. And he said, Tarek, if your stepdaughter gets a terminal illness and she dies, do you believe that could be the will of God? If you are in a car accident tomorrow and you're unable to provide for your family, could that be the will of God? If someone breaks into your house and steals everything that you own, or your house burns down, could that be the will of God? I'd never taken much time to consider the other side of the equation. And so he said, Tarek, I want you to sit with this consideration for the next week. Ask yourself, what are you willing to put on the altar to God? You're saying you sincerely took such a position in the third step, and you abandoned yourself utterly to God, and you offered yourself for God to do whatever he wants to do with you. What do those things mean to you? So he broke down that prayer in the third step in a way, that I had no experience with that. And it was a very uncomfortable experience. And so I sat with it, and then I made the decision, and I started writing inventory. And that happened at the beginning. This was January of 2014. And so the events I'm about to describe to you, I call this one of the dark periods, the desert experience in my 16 years. The first thing that occurred was I slipped on the ice and I hurt my back. And the back pain was intolerable at times. And I had to consider pain medication, which I declined. But this is how bad the pain was. And then shortly after that, I had a kidney stone for the first time, which if anyone on this call has had one, we know how catastrophic that pain is. Shortly after that, I found out I had to have knee surgery. And so I'm going in for this knee surgery, and they're telling me that I'm only going to be on crutches for 3 to 5 days. I'll be fine. It's just a torn meniscus, where they go in to have the surgery and they discover that I don't have any cartilage left in my right knee. So what went from 3 to 5 days became 6 to 8 weeks. And as a result, I started gaining weight because I went into a deep depression. Shortly after that, our house gets burglarized. And my former wife and my stepdaughter are terrified. They don't want to be in this house. So at 6.5 years, clean and sober, I have to move back into my parents' basement with my former wife and my stepdaughter. And that was extremely difficult at that time. We also had a weekend where my former wife went out of town on a girls' trip, and I had to put our family dog down while she was gone. That was a very difficult experience. And then I go to the doctor to have my sinuses checked out, and the camera accidentally goes to the back of the throat, and they discover a mass on my vocal cord that they needed to remove and biopsy. And so the fear that comes with that, not being able to use my voice for an extended period of time after the surgery, having a sinus surgery and 2 other surgeries that I had to deal with. All these events took place in the span of 9 months. And one last event, that summer, my stepdaughter started having seizures, and we found out she was epileptic, and we had to spend 3 days. So all of these events. So I remember one specific afternoon, I was putting on one of my favorite shirts, and it didn't fit. And I'm looking at the mirror, and I am so angry with whatever God is. I was screaming profanities at God. I didn't understand why all of these things were happening to me. Meditation was no longer producing any effect. The prayers that I was saying were evaporating off my tongue. They didn't mean anything anymore. I couldn't shop or buy enough things. I became very disillusioned with life in general. And I walked out and I tore the shirt off like I was the Incredible Hulk. And I was screaming at the top of my lungs. And then I was taken down to the floor onto my knees. And I said, God, please help me. I had no other place to go. With all that anger and all that rage, all I could do was ask God to keep me safe and protected. And for me, that's a turning point, because it was another genuine surrender. And thank God I had worked out in the spiritual gym. I was working with sponsees during that time. I was taking phone calls. I was taking commitments. I was still going through the motions of prayer and meditation, although they weren't producing anything. And all of those actions, they informed that experience where I dropped to my knees and I asked God for help. And he picked me up, and he carried me through that dark period of time. And that prepared me for future darkness, because it created an experience with faith and trust. Trusting God does not mean things are going to go well circumstantially in our lives. It means I'm going to be able to address the situations, that not one day is going to come up in my life where I don't have everything I need. I'll have my spiritual bread. It'll be there if I'm working out in the spiritual gym. One more story I'd like to share with you about sincerely taking such a position is this idea of praying for outcomes and like wanting guidance and direction. And I want to be certain before I take this. Is this God's will for me to make this decision? And it's a difficult place to be at. And I don't know if we ever get any clear indication of making right decisions or not. But I had an experience where I was disillusioned with an employer, and I wanted more money, and I was a high performer. But I also had this vision of owning my own recovery center, a 12-step immersion program. And so I put together a business plan. I shopped it around to some people, and I found a man that was willing to give me $140,000 to help me start this business. Before I made that decision, I went to my employer and said, hey, look, if you give me this raise, I'll stay, but otherwise I'm going to leave. And they refused at first. And so I continued to work on the business plan and start taking these actions to open this facility. And a few months later, my employer comes to me and says, hey, they could tell I was checking out. They said, hey, do you want to give us a description of your dream job with our organization? How much money do you want to make? And I was angry at this point, because I was like, why didn't you just do this a few months ago? And so now I've been placed in a place where I didn't know what decision to make, right? I didn't know which course to take. And I started praying for an intuitive thought or a decision. And they ended up offering me more money than I'd ever made in my life if I would stay. I had this other business opportunity to open my dream, which was a recovery center. And I'm sitting there and I'm praying every day. Is this your will, God? Which way do I go? And I would talk to people in the program, and some people would say this and some people would say that. Uncertainty is the only thing that was certain about my experience at that point. I come out of my meditation room one morning, and my stepdaughter at the time was 7 years old. So she was drawing all over it, papers everywhere, drawings all over the house. And her and my former wife had left for school. I come down, I'm straightening up around the house, and in the living room den, there's a drawing on the coffee table. And what the drawing is, it's a bunch of stars with a red box, and inside the red box it says "Follow your dream." So I called my former wife and I said, "Hey, why did Callie draw this?" Asked her. And she said, "I don't know. I was supposed to draw that." And I made my decision to leave my employer, the most money I'd ever made up to that point, to go open this treatment center. And I thought I was like, God had come down himself and gave me this letter and said, "You're going to go open this. You're going to be successful. You're going to help people. You're going to make money." And so I did. And for the next 3 years, I had a thriving business, but it also destroyed my marriage. That marriage ended. We were the two ships passing in the night. My ex-wife was the HR director at the largest brewery in Atlanta, Georgia, and I am running a treatment center for people struggling with drugs and alcohol. And so our lives were no longer parallel. They were intersecting and going in different directions. And that, coupled with the hours and the emotional roller coaster of getting close to clients and their families, back and forth. After 3 years, I decided it was time to walk away and do something else. And that's what I did. It's funny because I always felt like I had failed. For many years, there was a sense of failure, that I had made the wrong decision that morning when I followed the sign. But during that 3 years, there were many men that came through that program, many young men that recovered. I was able, my business partner, who was maybe my biggest hero in this way of life, his name is Dante. He was my business partner, and his daughter got sober. And later on, she would become involved with one of these young men that came through my program. And so a month ago, I got invited to her wedding. And her wedding was, she was marrying a man that went through the program that I had for 3 years. 2 of the groomsmen were other young men that had come through my program. I was sitting in this wedding understanding that I have no idea why I'm having the experiences I'm having. We always think the experiences we're having are for us. What if the experiences we're having are for God? They're not for us. And it all made sense to me. That program was only supposed to be there for those 3 years so those people could have their experiences. And now I'm sitting here, far removed from that experience. It's no longer a failure. It's a complete success in the eyes of God. Because had it not been there, that experience was not going to be available to those individuals. And again, like this, that when we sincerely take such a position and abandon ourselves to God, we start to see the face of God in every direction that we turn. And these are some of the experiences that I wanted to share with you, because at the end of the third steps, it says if we thought well before taking this step, making sure we're ready to abandon ourselves to God. And so what I want to leave you with today is this idea of sincerely taking such a position. It's the orientation that we have to this work as it relates to God, to having an awakened spirit that we can carry into all of our activities. Without an active 10th step, though, I will never see the third step this way. And I wish I had more time to talk, because the 10th step is what makes this possible. That every direction I turn, can I practice seeing the face of God? Can I remember God as often as possible? And then reality with a capital R will be what it is. I struggle when I say no to reality. When I say yes to reality, that means I'm going with the flow of life. The greatest gift God has ever given me is my recovery. And what I do with my recovery is my gift back to God. And I hope God is as pleased with my gift to him as I am with his gift to me. I'm a member of Cocaine Anonymous. My name's Tarek.